Welcome to the opening of day 2. Certainly we wanted to start day 2 with something extremely high energy, fascinating, and exciting. So regulation, there you go. I know the subject you've been waiting for. Let me see how this clicker works. Oh, perfect. Sweet. So before I actually get talking about the pictures on stage, I want to tell you a story. So a couple of weeks back, I was doing a keynote for the Federation of North Ontario Municipalities. So pretty much as different as you could possibly imagine from who you are. We're talking about 300 people who have no technology background, and I was there to explain, how AI is going to work in municipalities. And there were a lot of questions after my talk. And bar one guy who asked me what's my favorite chat agent, GPT or what have you, every single other question was around how AI and technology is going to ruin the world. It was, what about my kids? What about my privacy? What about the government? Oh, kids was a great one. Well, what do you think about how technology these days is terrible? No one's talking to one another anymore. Everyone's just texting. I'm not sure what that had to do with AI. But every single question was rooted in fear. And the reason why I want to start there is I want you to understand that we're going to spend this day talking about how exciting and magical and good AI is, because we see the potential for what it can do for us. The average consumer is slightly terrified by what I've been told many times is going to be Skynet. I am sure you've all heard the Skynet comment too. So today, because the AI regulatory landscape changes so quickly that the description for this talk had to change between the point that I submitted it and today. Moreover, even yesterday when I was reviewing my notes, Trump announced a new AI thing. So look, it changes every single day. So today I'm going to take you through 3/3. We're going to talk a bit about about regulation as a framework. So I'll give you some ways to think about what regulation means as the concept of why. Then I'll give you, because I have to, a little bit of an update of what's happening today and where I think it's going to go in the future. And I'll give you some practical takeaways on how to talk to your business partners, board members, what have you, and technology groups around AI and regulation. This will be fun. So let's start with the pictures. I suspect not many of you know what this first image is. Obviously, it's a tablet, not the kind of tablet that you're used to seeing. This is the oldest written law that we have. So there were laws before. This is about 3,000 years old. And this law codifies what society at that time believed to be right and wrong, which is, no surprise, pretty similar to what we believe today to be right and wrong. So it says something along the lines of, don't murder, and sets out a penalty. If you murder, we will kill you. Maybe our laws are slightly different, because the second one goes, don't steal. If you steal, we will kill you. So there's a bit of a difference there. But the reason why I wanted to start here is that this idea of regulation and law is really around establishing trust between how we interact in society. The second picture is of the Gutenberg press. And it took about 300 years between the invention of the press and the first copyright law. And I'm going to posit that the reason why it took 300 years between those two things is it took 300 years for the press to be relevant to the average today public and consumer. Matter of fact, why we have the press or the media is because the Gutenberg press existed. And the copyright laws had to be created because we had to govern how do we distribute content. The last picture, probably more familiar, I'm assuming really familiar to all of you, is about 30 years old, so 3,330. That's around the time when internet, which you all know is way older than 30 years, but that's around the time that internet became really consumer accessible. And that's around when we have our first privacy laws. So this idea of how technology drives regulation and law is really what I want to unpack today. Because what AI is going to do to society and to the public will drive the regulation. And this last box is what, 3 years old? I'm not making up the rules of threes, but it is really poetic that all these things are some semblance of three. And it may be no surprise, I'm not sure how closely you follow the exciting world of regulation, I know. But we don't really have a lot today in place that can be super prescriptive. So I'm going to give you a bit of a framework of how can you understand or think about what regulation means to you as technology leaders. And then we'll go through a few examples and some context. One of the interesting things yesterday that I observed, and I'm sure all of you have observed as well, is the idea that we follow this pattern of why you do something, how you do it, and what are the actual actions. So we spoke about the why. The reason why we have regulation, or the reason why we have laws, is because we have a society in which we try to put some sort of rules so we know how to engage with one another. How? So when we put regulation in place, there's really two kinds in a hybrid. Rules-based regulation is the one you're all super familiar with. Speed limit. Either you're above the speed limit or you're below the speed limit. Rules-based regulation is great because you know exactly if you are following it or not. It's very binary. The problem with rules-based regulation is that it's somewhat onerous. You have to have a speedometer. You have to know exactly which speed you're going. You have to maintain it. Principles or risk-based regulation is basically indicating the kind of behavior you want to have. So drive safely is an example of that. And I'll give you a hybrid example. I'm not sure how many of you have been to Germany. I'm sure all of you know Autobahn has no speed limit. Drive safely, principle-based, risk-based. Some areas of Germany have speedometers that turn on if the weather is bad and then set out a speed limit. So that's a good example of a hybrid regulation, right? If something specific happens, we will institute a clear rule that you have to follow. Hybrid-based regulation is where I think a lot of AI regulation should end up. And unfortunately, rules-based, onerous to implement but easy to follow, principles-based or risk-based requires you to continuously monitor and maintain whatever it is that you're doing. So expect hybrid to unfortunately have the best and the worst of both worlds. Who? So who is not really who is enforcing the regulation. Any given regulation will be enforced by an agency, a regulator, a governor, so I'm not going to go into that. Whichever area of the country you're from, or province, or industry, you will all have different enforcers. Who is really the question of who came up with it, who needs it? Top down is very familiar. Government comes down and says, we have a problem, we're going to put a regulation in place because we want to fix this problem. And this is probably what most of you think regulation looks like. So when the government decided this is a problem, we're going to tell you what to do. But the reality is there is sector-based or industry-driven bottom-up regulation as well. Some examples include PCI compliance. So I'm not sure how many of you are in the financial services industry, but the PCI standards in terms of how do you digitally share transaction credit card payment information were driven by the issuers themselves. This was not a government prescribed thing. And the reason for that is around 2000, there was a lot of fraud, there were a lot of digital issues. The government was not reacting quickly enough, and so all the issuers got together and created their own standards that they enforce. And you have hybrid. Now, every time I've seen something written about any regulation being passed, it says government in partnership with industry. There's partnership and there's partnership. There's partnership where we check the box, and there's partnership where the government actually says, hey, we're going to pick some experts from the field, we're going to put you in the room, we're going to design this together. And finally, the what. The what impacts whether you care about this in a specific or in a generic way. Horizontal means everyone in the sector have to react to this. And I'll give you an example in a moment that will be very familiar to all of you. Sectoral is like financial industry, healthcare. And finally, use case based. It's based off the outcome. Let's get into some examples. How many of you are sick and tired of clicking I accept all cookies or reject all cookies? So yeah, thank you. One hand went up. I'm sure it's all of you. So why did rules-based regulation come for GDPR? Let's set the context. European Union is a union of many states. There was no one structure on how data was shared or protected across this union of states. So GDPR was I'm going to dare say, a bit of a knee-jerk reaction by the union on how to protect the well-being of the union. And therefore, it's somewhat top-down, somewhat aggressive, somewhat difficult and onerous from a technology and customer experience point of view in terms of implementation and maintenance. And it's horizontal. It doesn't matter where you are. If you are working with someone from Europe, or if your user could be European, you have to follow it. Thus, the box is all over the internet. More closely to Canada, the Privacy Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, which most people just call PIPEDA, was created by Canada as a desire, out of the desire to drive technology innovation. So principles-based, there's some rules everywhere, but it's really far more principles and risk-based than, say, GDPR. But it's still across the board and still applies to everyone. And we'll get into PIPED a few minutes later. EU AI Act, which I'll also unpack for you, but I wanted to contrast it to PIPEDA. So risk-based, hybrid. So EU is pretty cool because EU actually, this time around compared to GDPR, decided that we need to drive innovation, and the European Union wants to be at the forefront of innovation. Let's reset for a second. So we have, in 2025, China, US, EU. I mean, I should say Asia, but really China and India, right? Where EU was 25 or 50 years ago as a leader of innovation and creation is not the place they are in today. And so the way EU created AI regulation is far more friendly towards businesses and technologists, and far more looking into how do they drive innovation. So hybrid, very much done in partnership, and it's use case based, and I'll give you the use cases in a bit. Healthcare Insurance Protection Act. I'm not sure how many of you are American. This, though it regulates data, was not born out of the desire to maintain data privacy. This was passed by the Clinton administration because US had to figure out how to insure its citizens. And so the first act of HIPAA is actually far more about insurance and how insurance gets managed. How do we make sure that you can have healthcare regardless where you're at? Out of that, they had to figure out how to ease or define the administrative burden of said data. So not a great set of regulation from a data point of view because it was never meant to be. This was not designed with the eye towards innovation or data sharing or transparency. This was designed towards how do we administer insurance for our citizens. And the outcome from this, I'm not sure how many of you had to implement it, but it's onerous, it's difficult, it impacted negatively academia. So consequences from regulation drafted poorly are pretty bad. And finally, Basel III, which came after Basel II, which came after Basel, not one, because you didn't know that it was a one when it was a one. And all three of Basel implementations, which is the financial sector regulation, came out of the need to protect the financial sector. So Basel is driven by the industry and is implemented by the government. And a good example of a bottom-up implementation where the sector said, hey, we want to be more secure. We want to put better capital requirements in place. Let me step back in case you're not from banking, the exciting world of banking. This really prescribes how much money you need to have on hand so that you don't go out of business should the economy crash. That's your 10-second summary of Basel. The reason why I wanted to contrast these 5 scenarios is that regulation comes out of a societal reaction to some sort of change. In all 5 cases, there was a need by the government to react to something that was taking place. So where does this take us today? I'll talk a little bit about Canada, a little bit about EU. I'll give you the update as of yesterday of what Trump said, but I can't promise that this will hold tomorrow, so there's that. And then I'll leave you with some takeaways. Let's start with Canada. So regulation is a reflection of what we do. Did you know we had a federal election? Did you know there was an AI bill that completely died because we decided to have a federal election? Oh, there's a lot of head nods. Hey, I have my regulatory friends in the audience. So it's kind of a glass half full, glass half empty situation. It was pretty good that we started drafting an update to digital data privacy that's Bill C-27 with a subcomponent of how to manage AI. I have yet to meet someone who loved the bill. It was not drafted with in a way that will make it easier to implement or help innovation or help, frankly, clarify or protect the consumer, but it was a step forward. PIPEDA, 25 years old, 30 years old if you think of how long it took to pass, is around individual consent. Individual consent has nothing to do with training or models or predictability or outcomes from any given AI thing that you build. And so what we have today is only PIPEDA. One of the things that I'm sure you all have seen are these privacy notices. This is an email to update you that a privacy notice has changed, yada, 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 yada. So that's an outcome of PIPEDA, right? We have to inform you that we are now going to be getting and using your data in a different way. Not yet related to AI, but that's what we have. Now, the reason why I started with that email, and I want you to think about it from your team's point of view, is that someone in some org had to think about what that email contains. In other words, you have a chief privacy officer or someone who's accountable for the privacy policy. That's what you get out of policy and risk-based implementations. You need to have a person who thinks about how to explain back to the consumer how you as an organization meet whatever it is that, whatever principles that regulation sets out. So that's where we are in Canada. Mark Carney did speak about AI as top 5 things for industry, so it is a thing that they care about. And in my QR code, that's not a fish, I promise, there is a list of resources, including a really interesting website from the Government of Canada that lists out all of the things that they do with AI. So the government cares, obviously, as we all do, about AI. It's now, what's our bingo card? Everyone's going to talk about AI. But it doesn't create a policy. And so my opinion is that we're not likely to see anything in place for at least another year, because it's, what, halfway through 25. On the EU side, they passed an act last year that went into effect in February of this year called the EU AI Act. And like I said, that was driven by a desire of the European Union to create and drive competitiveness and innovation. They pretty much spell it out. And what EU did is they created this pyramid of risk. I'll take you through it because, first of all, you should know. But second of all, it seems to me, again, from the industry, that everyone's expecting to follow their pattern. So this pattern is pretty convenient, and it is something that you can take away today, because if what we've seen with GDPR, the world followed EU there, we can expect something similar here. Let's start with the unacceptable risk. So they put 4 risk categories in place. Unacceptable risk is basically Black Mirror. You cannot scan for biometrics. One example I saw was, you should not have children's toys that tell the kids to do bad things by using AI. I'm like, this is a very specific, like, whoever wrote that had something going on, maybe too many horror movies, I don't know. There's a number of things, but basically, don't be evil to whatever degree that is. That's your unacceptable risk. High risk are uses that are valid, but could have a significant negative consequence. An example would be predicting or deciding whether you're going to get a particular job or not, or get into university or not. Infrastructure, self-driving cars. And so what EU has said is if you are in the high-risk category, you're allowed to do this, but here are all the different ways that you're going to document and demonstrate ongoing that this model, this thing that you've built, is safe. This includes, how are you doing human oversight? How do you know that you're not biased? How do you prove to me as a regulator that what you're doing is not fundamentally wrong? Then they have this limited risk, which is interesting because they're basically like, oh, we just have to carve this one thing out, and that's chatbots. Basically, don't mislead. In other words, don't say, hi, I'm Anna, I can help you. You should say, hi, I'm Anna, I'm your AI chatbot, how can I help you? That's really the governance. I'm not your lawyer, not your lawyer, so please take this with a grain of salt, but in general, that's where you're going with this. And what I really love is that the last category is everything else. So what I assume is the vast majority of how all of you want to use AI falls into the low risk category, which requires no documentation beyond the fact that, yes, all our use cases are low risk. So your typical AI copilot, QA, test draft, or what have you, doesn't require anything. That's EU. Singapore and Brazil seem to be following the same direction. I think other countries will as well, except for US. So like I said yesterday, apparently Trump said that he will not want to see any AI governance for the next 10 years, which is like an eternity in this world. I don't know. And it also feels a little bit beyond his scope of actual employment. So we'll see what actually happens. I mean, Biden put some things in place. Trump did those things. But like I said, US seems to be a Wild West. I will acknowledge this. If you are working with US customers, that does make your life somewhat easier, because clearly, if you are doing something for the US, you will not have to worry about how do you explain to the US regulators that what you're doing is, high risk or low risk. But I invite you to still care about the EU pyramid. I personally think in a world where we talk about regulation, or I think about regulation as a reaction by the public to things which are scary or uncomfortable, this risk pyramid is a pretty nice way to break it down into, hey, this is where I live and work. I'll leave you with 2 takeaways. This picture I usually use with business users to explain what AI is. It's 3/3. It's easy to remember. Inputs, models, outputs. It kind of really simplifies AI down to like 15 circles. But the reason why I wanted to share it with you is this is a way for you to explain and maybe align with your business or legal stakeholders on how you're going to keep yourself compliant. You can talk about, here are my inputs. I'm not violating copyright, or this is how I got consent for using whatever data I want to use in AI for my models. Then you have your middle. How do you know you're not biased? How do you know you're not creating harm? Are you using something off the shelf? How are you maintaining that off-the-shelf thing? And finally, you have your outputs. Are you disclosing that you are an AI output, or whatever it is you're creating? How do you know the output is valid? So 3/3. Also, I find this demystifies AI for a lot of people in a very non-scary way, so go for it. I didn't create the picture, so I just made it blue. And finally, 5 questions. So this is more around of how do you size yourself against what you think your risk can be. And one of the things I wanted to call out is the geographic dependency, because we will certainly see regulation being very different by geography. And even though Canada is very likely to continue to lag, EU is already there. So there is something to be said for deciding how to measure yourself against, say, the risk category, even if you're not in EU. But I would argue that you should size all 5 of these questions against your tech team. The last question that I want to call out is someone monitoring the space? This is a talk in a point in time. This is not forever. And like I said, this seems to be changing every week. I'm happy to come back to your workplace every week if you want to hire me, but moonlighting outside of my CTO day job. But very seriously, you should somehow monitor the space. Because I will say, different sectors are moving at different paces. So I happen to have friends who work in dentistry, of all things, dentistry technology, and dentists care about AI. So dentistry may have its own evolution, which moves far faster than, say, other aspects of healthcare. And it's sometimes a bit of a fluke, right? You have a few influential speakers, and off the sector goes. Let me leave you with a few wrapping kind of thoughts. The reason why I wanted to give you this talk today, why I think this matters for you today, is I love to demystify technology for consumers. You don't need demystification of technology, but each one of you can further demystify what AI is and reduce the fear of Skynet with your business partners, your friends, your network. And I think it's really meaningful to explain and articulate, wow, that's very dramatic. It's a Skynet. To explain and articulate to the consumer how you use AI. This world we're in, both from a regulatory and technology point of view, is changing very rapidly. For the average person, rapid change is scary. And I want to see regulation, and I want to see change that's going to encourage innovation. And all of us in this room, whether you're creating something for the enterprise consumer or a final consumer, will want to explain how the thing you're creating is fundamentally safe. So this idea of trust to me comes back to the idea of safety and transparency. So I invite you all to think about the things you make through that lens. And now, I'm happy to take questions. what trade-offs have I seen leaders face between agility and compliance? You know, you're asking someone who runs a bank team. And I was just chatting to a friend here about how difficult it is to manage that trade-off. Frankly, the biggest trade-off is speed and sizing the risk. For those of you in less regulated industries, you're probably sizing the risk in dollars. If I'm down for 5 minutes, I lose that much dollars. I have to size the risk in terms of compliance. If I provide inaccurate information, I could be shut down. So the trade-off will be industry specific, and this idea of compliance will be industry specific. Speaking from a banking lens, and I will tell this to you as consumers within the industry, Canadian banking is heavily regulated for our own benefit. So I love it as a consumer. I sort of don't love it as a technologist, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, by vast and large, it is speed. I think that's the biggest trade-off. It's not anything else. What's the regulatory stance on copyright protections on the sources used? Well, I mean, that genie is out of the bottle. The idea of copyright and how you use it for training is really complex. There were a couple of authors who already launched lawsuits against OpenAI around how their data was incorporated. But my take on it is that for the public models that were trained on the internet, so to speak, that, again, genie left the bottle. There is no undoing it. The LLMs have been trained. I think it's far more interesting to think about it from the point of view of your implementations, especially if you're creating models or creating AI that's specific to your industry. How do you govern that? I don't know that there is a one-size-fits-all answer for copyright violation, but I will say that there is this idea of maybe consent or fair use. One of the interesting things about having done a law degree is that what I love about law is it feels a little bit like engineering for society, because it prescribes these rules around how you're supposed to interact and act. That's a little bit like, how do you create a class? How do you create an object? But then there was a lot of gray area where if it's reasonable, I think the word is reasonable, that's been used like 1,000 times in 1 year. It's crazy. So I would say if it's reasonable for you to use this information, you can use it to train your algorithm. But again, I'm not a lawyer, not you're a lawyer. There is no clear regulatory stance, however. I will say that. The regulatory stance for Canada, like I said, is governed by individual consent, which is not even related to training AI models, so it's not even going to get you anywhere meaningful. Thank you for all the questions. This is great. How do you evaluate vendor and partner solutions that use AI? So from an enterprise point of view, from what I've seen, most enterprises are really struggling with figuring out how to even inventory AI use cases, let alone evaluate partners that have AI use cases. And I'm not talking about the technologists in the room who build platforms that power AI. I'm talking about it's a procurement system that's going to decide whether this vendor is good or bad, just to cherry pick an example. I think that what I was talking about, the inputs, models, outputs, and using the risk pyramid, the EU risk pyramid on the outputs, is a great way to explain to someone who's not a CTO or an AI professional how your solution could be compliant or will be compliant as the world evolves. I'm going to move to the next one. Companies often use, I really am sad that I cannot debate this. I really want someone to be like, but no, I disagree with your answer. You're welcome to come afterwards and chat with me about this. Companies often use LLMs that are black boxes. I will challenge you right there. I don't think companies often use LLMs at all. I think consumers use LLMs that are black boxes. But I would argue a vast majority of enterprise companies are pretty much doing this as far as LLMs go. Because outside of Microsoft and Copilot, and I'm talking enterprise like 20,000 people, there is nothing that's really cost-effective in terms of scaling. What I've seen in smaller companies is, yeah, you're going to get your Copilot or, sorry, ChatGPT or Cloud, whatever, company license that's maybe scaled to, 300 people, 500 people. Beyond that, it gets honestly expensive. I have seen some solutions that help create a layer between an end user within an enterprise or within a company and all the different chatbots. But I'll take it back to not Pipit, but privacy and 30 years ago when the internet came to be. Remember how we're all struggling, or maybe weren't struggling, but thinking of when I go to work, will Facebook be blocked? But like, I need Facebook to ask my friend a question. It's the same kind of challenge that there is no real clear answer. And I don't think the answer will be pure tech or pure governance. I think it will be a mix. So that privacy and compliance answer will be evolved. It's a very wishy-washy answer there, but it's the reality. Software services, banking clients in Sri Lanka have requested we avoid using AI in software development. So I would try to understand why are they asking you. Because this is a what, but the why is interesting. Is it because they have regulators they have to explain something to? Because maybe Sri Lankan regulators have some specific interests that you don't know about. If you understand the why, then you can address that question more directly and possibly articulate how you can still use AI to, write your code or what have you, without having a negative impact on their banking operations. This is basically brings me back to where I started. Regulation is a knee-jerk reaction against fear or something big happening. Not a knee-jerk reaction, but can be a knee-jerk reaction. This kind of response from your client is a knee-jerk reaction, usually because there is no regulation to protect them. So start with the why. Thank you. I think that's all my time for today.